In the spring of 1902, a civil engineer named Walter Pruitt stepped off a federal survey barge at the western end of Galveston Island, Texas, and onto ground that the great storm of September 1900 had stripped of every structure, every tree, every visible human mark, down to the bare shell sand. He carried a transit level, a steel chain measure, and a field notebook with a green cloth cover that his division chief at the United States Army Corps of Engineers had issued him before departure. His assignment was precise: survey the island's subsurface grade along the western storm line, the boundary at which the September hurricane had scoured the ground to maximum depth, and produce an elevation and soil composition record that the Army Corps would use to plan the Galveston seawall construction. It was routine post-disaster assessment work. Pruitt had done it twice before, in Johnstown and in Beaumont. He knew the methodology. He knew what post-storm subsurface surveys produced. What the western storm line of Galveston Island produced in the spring of 1902 was not something his methodology had prepared him for, and the green cloth field notebook in which he recorded it was rewritten. Not corrected, not amended. Rewritten twice. The official record of the 1902 Galveston Subsurface Survey, as submitted by the Army Corps of Engineers to the Office of the Chief of Engineers in Washington, and as held today in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, is a clean document. Uniform handwriting, consistent notation, no corrections, no strike-throughs, no marginal annotations, no indication of any finding outside the standard parameters of storm damage elevation and soil composition assessment. It is the final version of the survey. It is not the first version, and it is not the second. The Army Corps of Engineers' own internal administrative correspondence from the summer of 1902, correspondence that is held in the same National Archives collection as the survey itself, in a separate folder of project communications, contains a routing memorandum from the division chief, a colonel named Henry Biddle, instructing that the initial field notes submitted by Pruitt be returned to him for revision. The memorandum gives a reason. The reason is administrative inconsistency. It does not specify what was inconsistent. Colonel Biddle sent the notes back twice, 2 revision cycles, on a storm damage survey. Walter Pruitt was not a difficult employee. He was not a man who invented things. He was a licensed civil engineer who had worked for the Army Corps for 11 years without a single notation of professional irregularity in his personnel file. He had completed 9 prior federal surveys, all of them accepted on first submission without revision request. His performance evaluations for 1899, 1900, and 1901 are in the Army Corps personnel records at the National Archives and describe him consistently as methodical, reliable, and precise in field notation. After the Galveston survey, he submitted to revision twice and produced a final document that Colonel Biddle accepted without further comment. Then, within 6 weeks of the survey's formal acceptance, in August 1902, Walter Pruitt resigned from the Army Corps of Engineers. His resignation letter, 1 paragraph long, cites personal health. There is no Army Corps medical record for Pruitt in his personnel file from that period, or from any period prior to his resignation. He was 44 years old. The first version of the field notes was never returned to Pruitt after the second revision was submitted. It remained in the Army Corps administrative file. It is not there now. If buried records and erased findings are the kind of history that pulls you back, hit subscribe and ring the bell so the next investigation reaches you when it drops. This kind of research tends to disappear from feeds unless you tell the algorithm to keep it. If these investigations matter to you, you belong here. To understand what Walter Pruitt found beneath the Galveston storm line, we have to go back not just 2 years to the hurricane, but to a version of Galveston's history that the standard account has compressed almost entirely out of existence. Galveston Island in 1900 was the largest city in Texas. It was the 4th busiest port in the United States. It was a city of 52,000 people, many of whom had been there for 2 and 3 generations, living on an island whose recorded European settlement dated to the 1810s, and whose prior human occupation stretched back across many centuries of coastal habitation. The ground beneath Galveston Island was not empty ground. It was layered ground. It had been built on, worked, and lived across by multiple successive populations before the first Texas charter was ever filed. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the official history of the Gulf Coast of North America, particularly the period before European contact in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, is incomplete in ways that academic archaeologists have consistently declined to engage with publicly. Stone construction has been documented in coastal subsurface surveys from Louisiana to the Yucatan Peninsula at depths that predate any population the mainstream record acknowledges in those regions. Spanish colonial accounts from the 1520s and 1530s describe encountering stone structures along the Texas and Louisiana coast that no subsequent survey has located or explained. And the Gulf Coast's repeated hurricanes, events of the kind that struck Galveston in 1900, have a documented history of exposing subsurface layers that are then recovered by storm debris before sustained examination is possible. Galveston in 1902, in the spring months after the worst Atlantic hurricane in recorded American history, was one of the rare moments when that ground was exposed long enough for a trained observer to work it systematically. Walter Pruitt was that observer, and Dr. Samuel Everett was the man beside him taking core samples at the one location on the western storm line where the subsurface anomaly was deep enough to require geological boring rather than surface documentation. The Great Storm of September 1900 killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people in a single night, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. It also did something that disaster assessors in 1902 had not fully anticipated. It stripped the island's surface to a depth that had not been exposed since the island was last shaped by the sea. In sections of the western storm line, Army Corps borings in early 1902 reached soil layers that had not been disturbed in what the Corps' own geologist, a man named Dr. Samuel Everett, estimated as several centuries at minimum. Dr. Everett's geological assessment for the western storm line is part of the official 1902 survey record held at the National Archives. His estimate of several centuries appears in that document. What does not appear in that document is the notation he made in his personal field log, separate from the official record, on the day he took core samples from the third bore position along the western line. Dr. Samuel Everett's personal field log for 1902 is held in the Rosenberg Library in Galveston, Texas. The oldest public library in continuous operation in the state, established in 1904 on a bequest from the banker Henry Rosenberg, who died in 1893, and whose will funded the library's construction despite the fact that his original building was destroyed in the 1900 storm and had to be rebuilt before opening. Everett donated his personal papers to the Rosenberg in 1931, the year before his death. The papers include 4 field logs covering his work on the island from 1899 through 1906. The logs are cataloged and accessible to researchers through the library's Galveston and Texas History Center. The entry for April 17, 1902, in the third field log, is written in Everett's standard notation style for 11 lines, bore depth, core diameter, soil composition by layer, compaction index, moisture assessment. Then it stops. The next notation, which begins on a fresh line below a visible gap on the page, is in a different pressure, heavier, written more slowly, as if set down at a different sitting from the technical lines above it, and reads only, "Not for the record." The lines that follow that notation are not in Everett's geological shorthand. They are in plain English, and they are the only entry in 4 field logs covering 8 years that Everett wrote in plain English rather than in technical notation. What those lines describe is the finding at bore position 3 on April 17, 1902, in the western stormline of Galveston Island. The core sample at that position, at a depth of 4 feet and 7 inches below the stripped surface grade, encountered a layer that Everett describes as cutstone, not natural formation, not shell aggregate, not compacted clay, but dressed masonry of a kind he identifies as pre-industrial by its tool marks. Beneath that layer, the core continued into a void space. A sealed void. Everett describes the core returning from the void with material on its tip that he identifies as charred organic matter, not decomposed organic matter. Charred, as if whatever was in that void had been burned long ago and sealed over. He wrote those lines. He marked them not for the record, and he donated those logs to the Rosenberg Library 29 years later, with that entry still inside them. But here is what makes Walter Pruitt's twice rewritten field notes connect directly to what Samuel Everett wrote in plain English on April 17, 1902. Pruitt's survey route and Everett's boring positions overlapped on the western stormline at exactly one location, the stretch between what the 1902 survey grid designated as stations 14 and 17. That is the section of the line where Everett's bore position 3 was located. It is also the section of Pruitt's original field notes, the first submission, returned by Colonel Biddle for revision, that fell within the portion of the route that Pruitt's original notebook covered before revision. We know this from the routing memorandum itself. Colonel Biddle's revision memo specifies, with the precision of an administrator protecting himself from ambiguity, that the inconsistencies requiring correction are located in the station 14 through 17 section of the submitted notes. He does not describe what the inconsistencies are. He does not use the word inconsistency to describe any other section of the notes. Station 14 through 17, the same stretch, the same spring, the same ground. The United States Army Corps of Engineers has never adequately explained why a senior civil engineer with 11 accepted federal surveys to his record required 2 full revision cycles on a standard post-storm assessment. It has never explained why the revision memoranda from Colonel Biddle identify the same geographic section, stations 14 through 17, that corresponds to the location of Dr. Everett's bore position 3 and its not for the record notation. It has never explained what became of the first submission of Pruitt's field notes, which the routing memorandum confirms were returned to him, but which are not present in the administrative correspondence folder that holds Colonel Biddle's memoranda. And it has never explained why Walter Pruitt, a 44-year-old engineer with 11 years of clean federal service, resigned citing personal health 6 weeks after his finally accepted survey was filed, with no Army Corps medical record to support that claim. The pattern of post-disaster federal surveys producing clean final documents while initial field notes disappear from administrative files is not unique to Galveston in 1902. In the aftermath of the 1889 Johnstown flood, a Corps survey team submitted initial findings in September of that year that were recalled by the supervising major before transmission to Washington. The recalled notes do not appear in the Corps' Pennsylvania district records for that period. The final Johnstown survey, submitted in November 1889. Contains no notation of any geological anomaly in the flood-stripped terrain. A junior surveyor on that team, a man named Paul Gentry, described in a letter to his brother written in December 1889, a letter that is held in the Cambria County Historical Society in Ebensburg, Pennsylvania, that the initial recall had been ordered because of what he called findings outside the brief that the major would not put in a federal file. Gentry did not elaborate. He did not need to. Outside the brief, recalled before transmission. Clean final document. Galveston 1902 is not the first time this sequence appeared in Army Corps post-disaster survey records. It is simply the time when a geologist wrote down what he found in plain English and left the notebook where someone could eventually read it. Why would Colonel Biddle return field notes for administrative inconsistency without specifying in any surviving document what was administratively inconsistent? Why does the geographic section he identified, stations 14 through 17, correspond precisely to the only location on the 1902 Galveston Western Storm Line where an independent federal geologist recorded a subsurface anomaly and then marked his own notation as not for the record? Why would a geologist with 30 years of professional practice write 4 lines in plain English inside a field log, otherwise written entirely in technical shorthand, and mark it explicitly as not for the record, unless what he found at that location was something his professional notation system had no category for? If Pruitt's original field notes had contained only standard storm damage data, why were they returned twice by a division chief who had accepted 9 of Pruitt's prior submissions without revision? The honest answer is that we cannot know with certainty what those original notes contained. What we have is a geologist's plain English notation of dressed masonry and a sealed void with charred organic matter at precisely the location a division chief identified as inconsistent and had a civil engineer rewrite twice before the final document was accepted and the engineer resigned. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and a division chief who returns field notes twice but never specifies the inconsistency in writing is a division chief who knows that specificity creates a record he does not want to exist. The Rosenberg Library in Galveston, Texas, holds Samuel Everett's field logs. They are in the Galveston and Texas History Center, accessible to researchers during regular library hours. The catalog entry for the Everett papers is publicly searchable on the library's online finding aid. The April 17, 1902 entry is in the third of his 4 field logs. Not for the record. 4 feet and 7 inches below the stripped surface grade. Cutstone. A void. Charred matter that had been sealed inside it, undisturbed, for longer than Samuel Everett's geology could date. The National Archives in College Park holds the 1902 Galveston Survey. It also holds the Administrative Correspondence folder containing Colonel Biddle's revision memoranda. Both are in Record Group 77, the Army Corps of Engineers Records, Entry 103, Project Files for the Galveston District. Both are accessible through a standard archival research request. What is not in that folder, what is confirmed by Biddle's own routing language to have once been there, is the first submission of Walter Pruitt's field notes. The folder contains the second submission and the final version. The first submission, the one that prompted the initial return, is listed in Biddle's memo as enclosed with this communication for your revision attention. It is not enclosed. It is not in any other folder in Record Group 77's Galveston District Holdings. A researcher named David Chen, who examined Record Group 77 for a 2013 study of Army Corps post-disaster survey methodology at Texas A&M University, noted the absence in his unpublished research log, a log that he shared with a colleague at the University of Houston. who cited it in a footnote in her own 2015 work on Gulf Coast infrastructure history, and made a formal inquiry to the National Archives reference staff. He received a standard reply: "The item is not located in this collection." That reply is dated March 14, 2013. It is included in David Chen's research log. The log is not publicly archived, but Chen shared its contents with this investigation directly in response to a research inquiry submitted in writing, not located, in a folder where the routing memorandum confirms it was placed. The official record of the 1902 Galveston survey tells us it was a routine storm damage assessment that produced clean and consistent findings that formed the basis for the seawall project planning. What the evidence tells us, Everett's plain English notation, Biddle's twice-returned revision request, Pruitt's unexplained resignation, and the first submission field notes that were confirmed as present in an administrative folder and are not there. Is that what the survey team found beneath the western stormline of Galveston Island in the spring of 1902, passed through the federal record not once but 3 times before it became the document that is publicly available today? The first version went back for revision. The second version went back for revision again. And the first version, the one that prompted the process, has not been seen since. These records survive because a federal geologist wrote 4 lines in plain English inside a technical log and marked them not for the record, and then held those logs for 29 years before giving them to a library. Subscribe and share this with someone who believes the Army Corps of Engineers keeps its field records complete. History does not disappear when notes are rewritten. It disappears when no one asks why they were rewritten twice. Next week, I am following the thread from the Galveston stormline to a second Army Corps survey conducted on the island in 1906, 4 years after Pruitt's rewritten notes were filed. That survey, led by a different engineer named Marcus Albright, contains a single notation in its geological appendix referencing prior anomalous subsurface findings at the western terminus that Albright's own team was directed not to re-examine. That direction came in writing. The letter is in Record Group 77. You will not want to miss it.